Hello everyone, this is Mehdi and welcome back to another episode of the Subcontinent. Our program aims to address the ongoing issues across the subcontinent that affect the governments, communities, organizations and the region as a whole. We will try to explore and explain its geopolitics, untangle the arguments from different perspectives and make the alternative voices heard with extra help from experts and people.
In this edition of the Subcontinent, we are going to talk about the US military retreat from Afghanistan at a time when the Taliban is making rapid gains across the country and the central government in Kabul is staring into oblivion. And we shall delve into the possible scenarios for the future of the war-ravaged country and its repercussions for the neighboring countries.
Afghanistan lies on the edge of the Indian subcontinent in the lap of towering Hindu Kush mountains. The country, invaded by many foreign forces in its history, has come to be known as the graveyard of empires. The past 2 decades of military occupation of the country by the US-led coalition forces has created a predicament which impacts far beyond the region. For any conceivable scenario for the future of Afghanistan, be it a Taliban takeover or years of civil war or the rise of Takfiri terrorist groups like Daesh, the ensuing issues would affect not only countries in the neighborhood, but the whole world.
Militaristic meddling in the developing world has for long been a defining feature of American foreign policy, with hegemonic ambitions at the heart of it. The longest US war in Afghanistan was launched in 2001, months after the 9/11 attacks and falsely projected as a global war on terror. The stated objective was to decimate the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. 20 years down the line, Taliban is stronger than ever, controlling 1/3 of the country and marching with force and ferocity, while the foreign occupying forces, led by US, have lost the plot. The US military-industrial complex has been engaged in futile and seemingly endless wars all over the globe. Vietnam, Guatemala, El Salvador, Panama, Cuba, Nicaragua, Congo, Haiti, Grenada, Greece, Cambodia, Iraq, Syria, Yemen. The list goes on. Future archaeologists will be stunned by the traces of American military equipment found almost everywhere in the world. That's what the legacy of America has been.
The fact that the US forces faced a disgraceful defeat in Afghanistan is no secret. But how did the hawks in Washington arrive at the decision to quit after setting lofty military goals for themselves for 20 years? How they felt there was no military solution to the crisis after destroying lives and livelihoods with airstrikes over the years? The answer to these questions can be found in the pages of history. It's imperative to wind back to 2001 when the US snubbed calls for the Taliban for dialogue and invaded the landlocked country with its allies. As the hegemonic forces call it quits, it's time for regional countries to play a role in facilitating peace, promoting rule of law and rebuilding the institutions of governance. Iran's role remains a key, as was evident from the intra-Afghan talks in Tehran last week. Iran is batting for an inclusive government with the participation of all political and ethnic groups, which includes Taliban. That should be a good way forward.
A few weeks after the tragic events of September 2011, the George Bush administration started the campaign dubbed the Global War on Terror, and Afghanistan, then ruled by the Taliban, was the first battleground. By October, the US and its allies started the bombing campaign in the country, purportedly to decimate the Taliban and crush Al-Qaeda hideouts. Taliban was considerably weaker back then, and there was no such group as violent as Daesh in the world. Taliban had even reportedly offered to hand over Osama bin Laden, the Saudi-born former CIA ally who masterminded the devastating attacks, to a third country to be tried, but the US administration snubbed the calls. In the following years, the foreign occupying forces consolidated their hold over the country, emboldening the Taliban to carry out indiscriminate attacks. Despite persistent calls for withdrawal, the US and NATO forces stayed put. Over the years, their counter-terrorism operations in Afghanistan spawned horrible human rights abuses, killing of innocent civilians in drone strikes, summary executions during night raids, illegal detentions, custodial torture, and patronage of former warlords and militia commanders. It only created more insecurity and emboldened the militant groups to up the ante. It also created strong anti-American sentiment in the war-ravaged country. Today, Taliban and its affiliates are in control of the large swaths of Afghanistan, having seizing many provincial capitals. In the words of former Afghan President Hamid Karzai, the US legacy in Afghanistan is a total disgrace and disaster. That is what it will be remembered for. With the foreign occupational forces leaving a vacuum, it is the time for regional countries to step in and facilitate the rebuilding and reconstruction of the war-torn country, including the institutions of governance lying virtually defunct, primarily due to US penchant for chaos and mayhem.
Neighbors of Afghanistan have very central role in Afghanistan. As you know, Afghanistan is a landlocked country, and obviously Chabahar of Iran and Karachi and Gwadar ports of Pakistan can play a very significant, important role in Afghanistan's economic development. All these countries need each other in order to survive economically and also live peacefully. If it is the issue of water in Afghanistan, if it is the issue of transportation and economics, and as well as the Islamic world, the consequences for our neighbors would be just best opportunity to explore the opportunity that can come with peace in Afghanistan. Afghan people would like to have relationships people to people. We love to have relationship with all our neighbors as brotherly relationship. The governments can come and go, today one person, the next day another, but these nations are here to stay. So they can help themselves by helping Afghanistan. If there's peace in Afghanistan, if there is a political stability in Afghanistan, economical stability in Afghanistan, we all can benefit from it. But if there is war going on in our borders, obviously there are troublemakers that are waiting for these opportunities to take advantage of the situation and kind of mingle into internal affairs of all these countries. Therefore, the role of our neighbors is very significant. We respect them. Islamic Afghanistan would like to live in peace and brotherly relationship with our neighbors.
Iran's role as the closest neighbor of Afghanistan is clear. It hosted the successful intra-Afghan talks last week, in which both sides agreed to give peace a chance. Iran has sought an inclusive government with participation of all political and ethnic groups, including the Taliban.
In recent months, especially after the new US administration backtracked on the May 1st withdrawal deadline, the Taliban forces have overrun several areas across the country, including in the north that used to be a bastion of anti-Taliban resistance. According to some reports, the Taliban currently controls more than 2/3 of the border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan. Some reports suggest that the Taliban control more than 1/3 of the country's 400 districts, including an arc of land from the Iranian border in the west to the frontier with China on the other side of the country. Taliban officials say their fighters have taken control of 85% of territory in Afghanistan, a claim impossible to independently verify and disputed by the government.
The internal affairs of Afghanistan have always had far-reaching external ripple effects, especially for the region and in many conceivable situations for the future of Afghanistan. The neighboring nations are likely to bear a wide range of social or economic damage. Most of the scenarios are in a broad spectrum with numerous conflicting forces. Some of these forces push for a substantial preservation of the existing political order and social dispensation, while the opposite forces push for more control and gain for Taliban on the battlefield and in diplomatic negotiations. The scenarios in between these two extremes are either a form of power-sharing deal between the Taliban and key players or a protracted and fragmented civil war. However the stories unfold on the ground, Afghanistan does not seem to have tranquil or harmonious years to come, and all the countries in any geographical, political or societal connection with Afghanistan will be experiencing its reverberations, while only the extent of violence, amount of deaths and destruction, and numbers of refugees may vary.
The occupying US-led coalition forces are abandoning Afghanistan, with the Taliban becoming stronger than ever. The central government in Kabul is staring at oblivion, and the country's military lacks the necessary wherewithal to protect the war-ravaged country. The US forces invaded the region, faced a terrible defeat, negotiated the surrender, and now are trying to force the countries in the region and the international community to deal with the consequences of the mess it left there.
Unfortunately, the bleaker scenarios seem more probable to take place due to the ethnic and religious composition of the country, and the United States seeks to use such dark prospects as a leverage against the other countries of the region. Instead of being held accountable before the world for creating such a mounting disaster, Washington now pretends to care by talking about the insecurity along the borders, the spillover of violence to other countries, and the fate of victims. Although most of the followers of Taliban are from the Pashtun community, that is the biggest ethnic majority, the group cannot secure absolute majority because its ideology is not supported even by all Pashtuns, and it can't find takers among the other ethnic groups. And at this point, the group is simply too strong both militarily and politically to be expected to settle for a shared control. Therefore, competitive elections and constitutional commitment to the rights of women or religious and ethnic minorities may be about to leave the public discourse of the country, as Taliban wants profound social and political changes.
As long as there is a law in order in Afghanistan and the foundation of the communities are set up in a way that every human's dignity is respected, then I don't think there will be any difficulty with the Shia or Sunni or any other religion. For example, in Afghanistan, we have our Afghan Hindus. We have no problem with them. We love them to live the way they want to live, as long as they respect the laws and regulations of Afghanistan. There will be no problem. In regards to fundamentalism and all that, being a fundamentalist in regards to the reality and foundation of fundamentalism, that's not a problem. I don't think there will be in our Shia brothers and sisters in Iran and Afghanistan being majority Sunni. We have never had problems, and as you can see, there is 1 million, 2 million Afghans living in there. They have no problems.
Now, to have more insights, we are joined by Max Parry, investigative journalist. First of all, welcome to the program, Mr. Parry. A lot is going on in Afghanistan. Sometimes it's difficult to track the real or consequential ones and the developments that get the most coverage. Would you please walk us through the most significant developments from your perspective?
Well, as far as the most recent latest developments, what's significant to me is not just the pending U.S. withdrawal from the country, but really the manner in which it's being conducted, which it's pretty unprecedented and astounding that when U.S. forces left the Bagram Air Base, which they occupied for 2 decades, they shut off the electricity and they slipped away without even letting the new commander, that the Afghan brigadier general in charge of the airfield, know. And he only found out that they'd vacated the premises a few hours later. So that's really indicative of a serious breakdown in communication, which to me calls into question the whole relationship between the U.S. and the central government in Kabul, which has been losing one district after another to the Taliban insurgency, and suffering big losses as what's supposed to be the final American pullout. First, it was on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and then Biden abruptly changed it to the end of August. But so that not only is there a consensus building that the days are numbered for the central government, but there's widespread scrutiny that it might not last more than a few months. There's serious questions as to whether it can operate independently of NATO. But this really demonstrates to me a lack of loyalty on the part of Washington to the Afghan government, which it essentially created. And it also explains the low morale among the Afghan security forces, who've been deserting in droves. I think there was more than 1,000 or so to Tajikistan earlier in the month, alone. So at this point, to me, it just seems inevitable that the government in Kabul is going to fall. The conditions are ripe for a civil war, and the Taliban is likely going to retake power. And it just seems to me like it's not just the fact that the U.S. is finally withdrawing, but it's the haphazard way that it's going about it, which as many people have observed, it strongly resembles the way the U.S. pulled out of Saigon in 1975 at the end of the Vietnam War.
Mr. Parry, the Taliban have overrun areas bordering 5 countries: Iran, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, China and Pakistan. What are the consequences of a Taliban takeover for them?
Well, there's a number of factors at play geopolitically, and a number of different energy strategies for, in an equation of the Taliban leaving, or assuming control, and the U.S. leaving. For example, I know that they made advances in a province adjacent to Iran, Herat province, I believe, that's a vital geostrategic interest, because that's where the TAP pipeline, the Afghanistan natural gas pipeline, is supposed to pass through Turkmenistan into Pakistan, south into Pakistan, and transport oil into northern India. And that project is one of the reasons that many people believe, the real reasons that the people believe the U.S. actually invaded Afghanistan was because of a breakdown in negotiations between the Taliban and the U.S. Because the deal was secured after the Taliban were overthrown, and it's got strong U.S. backing because it would enable energy exports from Central Asia into Western markets, and it would bypass Russia and Iran.
The U.S. war in Afghanistan has created millions of refugees. Several regional countries have provided sanctuary for many of them. How do you think the world can hold Washington responsible for the way of life that Washington has imposed on them? And what can the UN or human rights organizations or the entire international community do?
Well, in an ideal world, they would be able to do a lot more. They would be holding Washington accountable for the humanitarian crisis that it's responsible for. But unfortunately, I think a lot of these civil society groups and human rights NGOs and, the United Nations itself, they're all highly politicized. They're not impartial organizations, and more often than not, I would say that they end up actually being instruments of war. And in regards to Afghanistan, I mean, the Bush administration frequently cited human rights to justify the U.S. invasion to begin with. That it wasn't just about the pretext of fighting terrorism, but it was about liberating the Afghan people. Bush frequently cited the treatment of women. And, we've seen many of these so-called human rights groups, like, for example, Amnesty International, they, for a few years ago, they did an ad campaign where they were essentially endorsing the NATO occupation, saying, to keep up the good work regarding, keep the progress going regarding, the treatment of women. And they were, crediting the military intervention. So, although of course there are humanitarian agencies and human rights groups that do real good work, unfortunately, more often than not, I think because of their funding and their influence, they become tools for empire, or at least the most powerful ones do. And those are the ones that, that would be capable of holding Washington to account. But that's in an ideal world that would happen, but I just right now I don't see the international community holding the U.S. responsible for the situation in Afghanistan. I mean, Donald Rumsfeld, the architect of the war, just died without having faced any charges or the UN and these human rights groups are not reliable to prosecute. It cannot be relied upon to prosecute Washington for its crimes against humanity.
Thank you, Mr. Parry, for your precious time, and we hope to have you again on the program. Now, let's see how people active on social media view the repercussions of the U.S. military withdrawal from Afghanistan for the entire region.
Carlos has pointed out the result of U.S. foreign strategies under the pretext of anti-terrorism activity. He believes that not only Taliban hasn't lost power over Afghan territory, but also they have expanded. Keith associates every death with failure as it has undermined values and standards that were once principles. Tom has expressed his disappointment about the $6 trillion budget waste, as it could be invested in productive schemes rather than occupying foreign lands, in this case, Iraq and Afghanistan. Muska has pointed out the difference on Biden's understanding over decisions on the matter of terrorism in Afghanistan. They believe that either his information or the policies in which he governs the US by is shown to be insufficient. Here we have Yalda explaining her perception of Karzai's speech, saying that US will not be welcome back for what they've done in the past.
Well, the United States came in the name of fighting terrorism to Afghanistan 20 years ago. Did they fight it successfully? Did they fight it honestly? No. Therefore, the United States returning to Afghanistan in the name of fighting extremism, I, as an Afghan, would not welcome that.
And that was our episode about the US retreat from Afghanistan and the colossal regional problems that would follow the decades of failed American military meddling in other countries. To watch a collection of bits and pieces of our show and more subcontinental updates, follow us on social media platforms, and don't forget to give us your feedback. We shall meet again, same time, same day, next week. So till then, take care.